Today, I want to explore a question that has shaped one of the most important debates in recent Australian history. Does our country need a specific Indigenous voice to Parliament? This isn't just a political question, it's one about democracy, history, truth telling, and how we imagine our shared future on this land. I'll start with some background context, then present both sides of the debate, why some argue a voice isn't needed, and why others insist it is essential. Finally, I'll reflect on the deeper challenge this poses for all Australians. Firstly, we acknowledge the Bunurong people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose knowledge and care for country have sustained these lands for millennia. In our work, we commit to listening deeply, working in genuine partnership, and supporting regenerative practices that restore and sustain both ecological and social systems. We honour Indigenous sovereignty as a living framework guiding us towards futures that are equitable, respectful, and sustaining for all. What is the voice? It is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. And the referendum asked us, do you approve this proposed alteration? The Voice is a constitutionally recognised advisory body that gives Indigenous communities a direct say in laws and policies affecting them. It doesn't make laws itself, but it ensures that the lived experience and knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples inform government decisions. It originated from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a landmark document calling for constitutional recognition and structural reform. In short, the voice is a mechanism for representation that strengthens Indigenous self determination, even if it doesn't enact sovereignty itself. Why do we have the voice? Indigenous Australians have been calling for a voice for nearly 100 years. This struggle for self determination is deeply rooted in history. Take Corranderk, for example, a Victorian Aboriginal reserve where leaders like William Barak fought tirelessly for land rights, fair treatment, and the right to manage their own communities. Barak and his people faced displacement, systemic inequality, and government decisions imposed without their consent, struggles that still echo today. The Voice seeks to address this ongoing legacy by ensuring Indigenous Australians have a direct role in shaping laws and policies, securing recognition in the Constitution, and creating a pathway toward genuine self determination. So, what exactly happened with The Voice? Well, leading up to the October 14th, 2023 referendum, there were four major fault lines that shaped its outcome. And this is highlighted by Williams, Wallowa, and Brennan in their ABC News article. Many Australians didn't understand what The Voice would actually do. Even campaigners admitted messaging was confusing. Trusted Indigenous leader Marcus Stewart noted that the general Australian community couldn't comprehend what exactly it was. This lack of understanding left room for doubt and lack of clarity. Did racism play a factor? Well, yes, Indigenous campaigners were targeted with abuse throughout the campaign. For many, the no vote felt deeply personal, a rejection not just of a policy but of their place in the nation. Some communities even observed a week of silence after the result. Misinformation also played a role. There were false claims such as that the voice would make and have lawmaking powers, which were spreading rapidly online. This unclear messaging made it hard to counter these myths and eroded trust in giving undecided voters a reason to vote no. Division. Without bipartisan support, the Nationals and Liberals opposed the voice, and the referendum was already vulnerable. Indigenous voices were also split. Some leaders supported the voice, while others, like Senator Lydia Thorpe, argued it didn't actually go far enough. This lack of unity made broad consensus almost impossible. The case for no. Those who argue against a voice often start with equality. They claim the Constitution should treat all Australians the same. Why should one group be singled out based on race or history? Indigenous Australians are already represented in Parliament, and leaders like Lydia Thorpe and Jacinta Nampijinpa Price and Ken Wyatt are elected through the same democratic process to represent their communities and constituents. The system, critics argue, already allows equal access to political channels. And some worry about division. Could a voice create a two-tiered system? Critics say it might embed racial distinctions rather than promote unity. Practical concerns also arise. The voice would be advisory only, so it couldn't make laws. So, would it actually deliver meaningful change, or would it risk becoming just another bureaucratic layer, tokenistic at best? From this perspective, Davis argues that resources might be better spent on health, education, housing, and jobs rather than constitutional reform. Theoretical framing can help here too. Cohn and Reddy describe how colonialism produced systemic exclusion and legitimacy deficits, which can support the argument that the political system already provides equal channels for participation. On the other hand, supporters argue the case for yes and argue that Indigenous Australians have been systematically excluded since Federation. Policies have often been designed for Indigenous people, not with them. Scholars like Ryan Douglas Cox describe this as a legitimacy deficit. Governments exercising power over Indigenous Australians lack legitimacy because systemic injustices persist and there are insufficient mechanisms to address them. Cohn and Reddy further situate this in the broader context and of the historical colonialism, describing it as a structure of domination that imposes foreign governance, erases local systems, and entrenches inequalities. In Australia, this legacy does continue to shape political, social, and economic outcomes for Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous Voice to Parliament is and was designed to address this deficit. As constitutionally enshrined advisory body, it allows Indigenous people to participate in decisions that directly affect their communities. While sovereignty and self-determination arguments are important, Cox further notes that the legitimacy argument alone provides a clear justification. The voice helps the government act fairly within the current political framework. Supporters also point to decades of failed programs. Despite billions spent, gaps in health, education, and life expectancy still remain. The voice could help ensure policies reflect Indigenous knowledge and lived experience. And finally, the voice is a step toward recognition and dignity. Constitutional recognition acknowledges Indigenous Australians' unique place in the nation's history and future. Far from causing division, it represents honesty, inclusion, truth telling, and a chance to correct structural inequalities. At the heart of this debate lies a profound challenge. How do we balance universal equality, which is treating all Australians the same, with historical justice, which recognises the unique and ongoing disadvantage experienced by First Nations peoples? The call for a voice isn't about creating difference for its own sake, but about correcting imbalance that is structural and systemic. Formal equality alone has never delivered fair outcomes because it overlooks the structural legacies of colonisation. This is why the conversation is so charged. It asks us to hold two truths at once: that all human beings deserve equal treatment, and that justice sometimes requires acting differently to achieve true equality. Throughout the campaign, many non Indigenous Australians feared the voice would lead to loss of equal status, division, costs, or unknown consequences. A lot of these were related to ownership and private property. Yet these fears reflect precisely the reality Indigenous peoples have lived for over 2 centuries: dispossession, systemic inequality, exclusion, bearing disproportionate costs, and navigating ongoing uncertainty. The irony is stark. What some feared as a future possibility is the historical and present experience of many First Nations peoples. As Patrick Wolf stated, invasion is a structure, not an event. In other words, decolonisation isn't a destination, it's an ongoing practice and one that requires our active engagement. Upon reflection, dignity and self determination are fundamental. All human beings, and especially those who have endured injustice and trauma under extractive systems like colonialism, deserve recognition of past wrongs and the freedom to live with agency, dignity, and respect. The Voice to Parliament gives Indigenous Australians a meaningful say in the decisions that affect their lives. As scholars like Davis have noted, it not only shapes Indigenous policy but also influences the character of our nation. Hobson Wensing also emphasised that the voice is a mechanism for justice and inclusion, helping Australia move toward a more equitable society. Our responsibility is clear. We must listen critically, engage respectfully, and act to build a just and inclusive nation. And we remember that decolonisation, again, isn't a destination, it is a continuous practice, one that we all must live by. And we can do that by supporting the voice today.